Welcome everyone this morning. The University of Arizona College of Applied Science and Technology in Sierra Vista, Arizona presents the Intelligence Community Center of Academic Excellence Guest Speaker Series, June 2nd, 2020. With us this morning, we welcome United States Army Officer Colonel Christopher D. Washington, currently serving with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency in Springfield, Virginia, as the Chief Middle East and Central Southwest Asia Strategies Division, Source Operations Group. The division encompasses overhead collection support to two geographic combatant commands, the National System for Geospatial Intelligence and policymakers. So a very broad portfolio that Colonel Washington is in charge of. And we're happy to have him because Colonel Washington has unique experiences to share and help us understand what it means by joint, interagency, intergovernmental, and multinational intelligence support. Now, just by the very nature of all those, that acronym itself, it stands for JIM, J-I-I-M. Jointness speaks to the military and the interagency coming together to work through the instruments of national power to achieve end states. Of course, the interagency and intergovernmental and multinational aspects, we're going to talk about that in depth during this talk. So stay tuned as Colonel Washington uses his really good vignettes. Look out for those vignettes to hear how he leverages the meaning of this acronym in this talk. So thank you, Colonel Washington, for joining us today. And before we dive in, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Craig, and obviously thanks for giving me this opportunity. So I've been an intelligence officer at the tactical and strategic level for the past 23 years. I'm married to Danette Carmona. My wife works at NRO. My oldest daughter is actually a 35 Fox stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado. So she's an intelligence professional as well. And then I have two smaller kids, ages 11 and 9, Christopher and Morgan. And I'm currently, like you said, assigned to NGA here in the DMV or Northern Virginia area.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Colonel Washington. And again, thanks for your service. I'll go ahead to the first slide and turn it over to you.
Okay, so as you can see, I'm not going to read the agenda, but this is what we're going to focus on for today's lecture. All right, next slide. So excuse me if I'm a little vague in some of the vignettes due to the classification levels of the information. I'm going to use a series of vignettes to explain the key topics in today's lecture. All the vignettes that I will use, I was either involved in the planning and execution or both. Today's lecture is going to touch on how the U.S. military works in the joint, interagency, intergovernmental, and multinational environment. Before we start, I think it's important to define the pillars that make up the JIM concept. Joint operations can be defined as the armed forces of the United States conducts military operations as a joint force. Joint connotes activities, operations, and organizations in which elements of two or more military departments participate. When I say military departments, think of Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and now the Space Force. I will be using European Command as an example of joint operations. The next pillar, interagency, is a broad term because it's comprised of organizations and agencies from the local, state, and federal levels. In the past few months, you've probably heard the phrase whole of government approach used widely to describe local, state, and federal actions during the current pandemic. The whole of government approach is the collaboration of the interagency on a crisis that affects national security. On the next slide, the Task Force Quiet Storm vignette will serve as an example. Moving to the next pillar in JIM, Intergovernmental Organization, or IGO, or International Organization, is an organization comprised primarily of sovereign states, referred to as member states, or of those intergovernmental organizations. IGOs are established by a treaty that acts as a charter, creating the group. Treaties are formed when lawful representatives of several states go through a ratification process, providing the IGO with international legal personality. Intergovernmental organizations are important aspects of public law. For the purpose of this lecture, we will reference the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, for the Combined Libya Fusion Cell vignette, and we will discuss in detail the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo vignette for intergovernmental organizations. And the last pillar is multinational. A multinational operation can be defensive, aggressive, or peacekeeping. In multinational operations, many countries make alliances to do the operation. The Combined Libya Fusion Cell and the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo will be our vignettes for multinational operations. So we've defined the pillars that make up GEM, so we have a baseline understanding. Now we can dig into the various vignettes that show the employment of GEM at the operational and strategic levels. The Islamic Jihadist Union terror plot is a solid example of joint interagency and intergovernmental operations. In 2006, I was a young Iron Major standing the European Command Watch in the European Operations Center, or EPOC, in Stuttgart, Germany. European Command is a unified combatant command that's composed of all service branches of the military. You've probably heard of Central Command and now Space Command, which all make up 11 unified combatant commands. European Command was my first introduction to the joint world. My non-commissioned officer who stood the intel watch with me was a Navy Petty Officer, first class. The Joint Operations Center Team Chief was a Navy Captain. The Deputy Team Chief was an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. Prior to European Command, the majority of my Army career was in Army units with some joint exposure from exercises in Operation Iraqi Freedom. So it took me a minute to learn joint doctrine and service-specific jargon like interrogative, VFR direct, and shipmate, just to name a few. In 2006, Africa Command was 2 years from full operational capability. So European Command's area of operation not only included Europe, but Africa as well. On the watch, I was responsible for monitoring 93 countries in Europe and Africa. On any given day within our area of operation, there was civil war, genocide, pandemics, and terrorist plots. As the Intel Watch Officer, it was my responsibility to monitor serial reporting on unclassified, secret, top secret, and NATO classified networks, and brief the Supreme Allied Commander Europe on daily intel related activities. In November-December of 2006, sensitive reporting identified 4 German cell members of a non-state actor group, the Islamic Jihadist Union. They were in the planning phase to attack US bases and establishments frequented by US service members in Germany. They were going to use a series of truck bombs to carry out their attacks. As the Intel Watch Officer, I was read into interagency and European Command special access programs. I can remember calling the European Command J2, Brigadier General Brian Keller. The J2 is the senior intelligence officer for the command. I often called General Keller on a secure phone at all hours of the day and night on sensitive developments about the terror plot. The J2 had to make timely decisions that were reported to the highest levels of the government. I was able to see firsthand how HUMINT, SIGINT, and GEOINT intelligence from the intelligence community in Germany aided in discoverability and connected unknown nodes of the terror plot and other IJU members operating in Germany and abroad. US and German intelligence drove a law enforcement action. German security forces in the summer of 2007 took down the cell. The picture in the upper right is that of the arrested Islamic Jihadist cell members. This example describes how European Command was able to incorporate joint and interagency partners throughout all levels of the planning and execution phases. My time on the watch was just under 10 months. So in the summer of 2007, I moved from the Intel Watch to the J32 Crisis Operational Planning Team. We were responsible in drafting the Operation Nomad Shadow operations order. Nomad Shadow was a bilateral intelligence sharing operation with the government of Turkey. The US and Turkey shared intelligence on the Kurdish terrorist group, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, better known as the PKK. At the time, it was the height of the Iraq War, and Turkey was postured to conduct a large-scale military cross-border operation into northern Iraq to attack PKK safe havens. The US sharing agreement helped to provide greater fidelity to the government of Turkey on PKK activity and negated the need for the large-scale military operation into northern Iraq. This example shows how joint and interagency intelligence helped shape two desired outcomes. It assisted a NATO partner in combating a terrorist threat and prevented the further destabilization of an already complex battlefield in Iraq. Multinational forces in Iraq were able to focus on al-Qaeda affiliated proxies and Iranian influence without the concern of a large-scale military operation in the north. Of note, Turkey has the second largest army in NATO. The two pictures on the left were taken in Ankara, Turkey, on one of our many planning visits with the Turkish General Staff. I have described to you guys joint, interagency, intergovernmental so far. The next vignette will encompass all the before mentioned to include intergovernmental and multinational. In 2013, I had the pleasure of deploying as the Deputy J2 to the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or MONUSCO. So yes, try saying that really fast a couple of times. It's a tongue twister. So working for an intergovernmental organization was nothing that I had experienced prior to my deployment to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. At the time of my deployment, MONUSCO had over 19,000 troops from 34 contributing nations and a new mandate that authorized the use of lethal force. So think find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, and disseminate. The tool to accomplish this new mandate was the Force Intervention Brigade. The brigade was comprised of one Tanzanian infantry battalion, one Malawian infantry battalion, and one South African attack aviation battalion. You can only imagine the communication barriers and basic understanding of the intelligence process that I had to work through with some of the soldiers within the J2. Not to mention, I had near-peer competitors from the likes of China, Russia, India, and Pakistan represented within the J2 shop. So just pause and think about that. China, Russia, India, Pakistan, all working side by side in the J2 shop for a common interest in the Eastern DRC. So we, the United States, in the last decade have lessened the interoperability of systems gaps among the services, but we still have work to do. So as you can imagine, working in an intergovernmental organization comprised of 34 countries, that it was difficult, to put it frankly, to send and receive data in the physical and virtual domains. To show you just how difficult it was, I'm going to talk about one of our operations and my high-speed, low-drag United States Air Force captain by the name of Lloyd Dabbs. Honestly, if not for Captain Dabbs' initiative and belief in the mission, a lot of MONUSCO's successes in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo would have been minimal. Captain Dabbs took it upon himself to become an all-source censor. He mapped out several armed militia groups that operated in the Eastern DRC. He accomplished this task by hanging out of a helicopter with an SLR digital camera that he used to map and geolocate militia groups. One of those militia groups was M23. M23 made national news in 2012 when they seized large areas of land to include the DRC and Rwanda border town of Goma. M23 was a group of former soldiers largely made up of Tutsis that opposed the poor conditions within the Congolese military. The group took up arms with the financial help of Rwanda and seized key terrain throughout northern Kivu. The northern Kivu province borders on the countries of Uganda and Rwanda. In 2012, M23 captured the town of Goma, forcing many civilians to flee to surrounding areas. So in 2013, M23 had moved its forces from the town to defensive fighting positions north of Goma. Disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, and peace talks with M23 had all but stalled. And M23 was continuing to commit war crimes. The Congolese government and MONUSCO's patience had run out, and we were keen to returning North Kivu to a normal state. Okay, now that you understand the complexities surrounding any intelligence-driven operation in the United Nations, imagine this. Imagine calling for fire to an Apache helicopter on the Verizon network from a Verizon iPhone. That's exactly what Captain Dabbs did. But instead of the Verizon network, it was the French Orange network, and he was communicating to a South African Royavac attack helicopter pilots on M23's positions in northern Kivu. Granted, it was not the most ideal way to prosecute targets, but the lack of interoperability of communication systems among the friendly forces was a mission showstopper. Instead, we used what was available to communicate intelligence through the land, air, and space domains. The M23 group was quickly defeated and fled into Uganda, where they surrendered in December of 2013. While working in the UN, I quickly found out that there was no classification guidance on how to safeguard information or analyzed intelligence. Information assurance agreements meant nothing to some of the troop contributing nations. I quickly found out who I could trust with sensitive but unclassified information. With the negatives came the positives. For many source networks that some of the troop contributing nations had developed over the years, they had many source networks. The valuable atmospherics and intentions provided key insights to senior decision makers. The picture in the center is the force commander's weekly battle update brief in Goma. The picture to the right is myself and my Swiss captain, Magic, in Kinshasa, DRC. Next slide, please. So now from 2011 to 2013, I was assigned to the Defense Intelligence. I think go back one slide. It's the one with Clapper. That one, yep. Okay, so from 2011 to 2013, I was assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency as a human targeting branch chief for a whole of government task force called Task Force Quiet Storm. The task force came into existence from a 2008 Brigadier General Flynn Joint Urgent Operational Needs Statement. The crux of his request was funding to attack the lethal aid networks, providing lethal aid support to terrorists in Iraq and Afghanistan. A key driver for General Flynn's request was the 2006 50 Omar Street cache discovery in Baghdad, Iraq. The cache was one of the largest finds of IED making material. Some of the material was actually US components from a company in Phoenix, Arizona. In 2009, Task Force Quiet Storm was stood up and funded by the Joint Improvised Explosive Defeat Organization with the mission to dismantle and destroy lethal aid networks targeting US and allied members in Iraq and Afghanistan. Key stakeholders in the task force included Central Command, Joint Special Operations Command, Treasury Financial Crimes Enforcement, Treasury Office of Financial Asset Control, Department of Commerce, and a host of other US and foreign agencies that brought different authorities and capabilities to the table. The hardest problem was bringing all these agencies to the table to share meaningful data. All too often, my targeting analysts would connect the dots using a myriad of unconventional data sources to develop the networks. And in the process, we would find multiple US and foreign agencies looking at the same individual or groups. The power came from the willingness of the organizations to share their unique data and our ability to structure and display that data in a coherent network. We started conducting targeting boards to deconflict the effects we wanted to take on various lethal aid networks. Dismantling the network was not always about kinetic action. However, the various partners, authorities, and capabilities were like weapon systems. We use those weapon systems through the land, sea, air, and cyber domains, often simultaneously, to dismantle and destroy the networks. Data and information sharing were precision-guided munitions within the task force that allowed for joint interagency and multinational collaboration for a common good and interest. Without the data or the willingness, you would just have weapon systems without ammunition. This vignette stresses the importance of collaboration and information sharing within the interagency. The last pillar of GIM is multinational. In 2015, Susan Rice, the former National Security Advisor to President Obama, tasked the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, with garnering a greater understanding of the situation in Libya. I was tasked with drafting a contingency plan for a multinational fusion cell comprised of NATO partners with equities in Libya. I was fortunate enough to be given the opportunity to stand it up with our host nation, and took the lead as a U.S. officer in charge and deputy director to the fusion cell. This was a unique opportunity to share intelligence and understand how other nations gathered and disseminated intelligence and their analytical methods for producing finished intelligence. So imagine 6 NATO partners editing a weekly defense intelligence report that in some cases reached the highest levels of their respective governments. So there was always some tension when it came to that editing, but we managed to put out a number of products. Now, the papers did not find anything that was not already known to the 6 partner nations, but what it did was forge a collaboration and build rapport with those countries. Lastly, if a multinational operation in Libya was to be conducted, I would like to think that the combined Libya fusion cell helped build that connective tissue for a coalition. Intel gains are not always in the foreground. Next slide. So, how does multi-domain operations factor into GIM intelligence? Before we can answer that, we need to ask, what are multi-domain operations and what are the domains? Army doctrine defines multi-domain operations as how the U.S. Army, as part of the joint force, can counter and defeat a near to peer adversary, think China and Russia, capable of contesting the U.S. in all domains, in both competition and armed conflict. So what are the domains? You have land, sea, air, and cyber are self-explanatory. However, space in the human domain needs some defining. The Kármán line defines outer space as the boundary from the Earth's atmosphere and outer space as the altitude of 62 miles above the Earth's mean sea level. Lastly, the human domain, think social, moral, cognitive, and the human domain is probably the easiest to weaponize and least costly. Think of social media and its ability to spread discourse without firing a single shot. We have identified the domains, so let me give you an example of an adversary that conducted a multi-domain operation. So, prior to 2008, Russia was relatively quiet, and the US was actively engaged in fighting 2 wars against non-state actors in Afghanistan and Iraq. Prior to the 2008 Russia-Georgia war, we at European Command had tracked several escalation of force events. Russia attacked helicopters firing on Georgia military positions within their separatist buffer zones. Russian MiG downing of a Georgian unmanned aerial vehicle. These, along with other provocations, would set the stage for the 5-day Russia and Georgia war in August of 2008. In late July of 2008, I was still in European Command J32, but I had transitioned from the Crisis Operational Planning Team to the Balkans and Caucasus Operational Planning Team. For those unaware, the Caucasus, it's a regional area that includes the countries of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And I was also in the process of preparing for an upcoming staff-assisted visit to Tbilisi, Georgia. The purpose of my visit was to assess their intelligence apparatus within the Georgian Ministry of Defense. As you can imagine, the staff-assisted visit was canceled when Russia invaded Georgia and quickly decimated one of their 3 combat brigades and laid waste to the Air Force and scuttled most of the naval vessels in the Georgian Black Sea ports. Here we see a campaign by Russia executed through the land, sea, and air domains. Also, Russia, for the first time, issued a coordinated cyber attack that coincided with a shooting war. The cyber attack targeted government communication nodes and resulted in the Georgian government's inability to command and control during the 5-day war. I was a lead intelligence planner during the war, and I was receiving all modalities of intelligence from tactical to strategic. This information helped European Command plan and execute assured delivery, which was the humanitarian mission into Georgia after hostilities had subsided. The Russian invasion into Georgia was cause for alarm within European Command and Washington, D.C. We definitely had to relook our priorities when it came to Russia. Next slide. So, as you look at the bullets on the slide, they are all linked to the space domain for good reason. Our near to peer competitors, Russia and China, are making technological advances in satellites and anti-satellite capabilities to deny, degrade, disrupt, or destroy US capabilities in space. Destroying or even spoofing a global positioning satellite could disrupt more than location and target data for the military. You may not know this, but the accuracy of the GPS time signals is only second to the atomic clock. ATMs and cash registers use GPS timestamps for transactions. Cell phone towers for routing calls and the global banking industry are just a few of GPS timestamped public use. One can only imagine if an adversary was to gain access to those satellites. This brings me to my last point. With the creation of Space Force and the reactivation of Space Command is how we as a military will evolve to meet the growing need in the space domain. Growing a cadre of qualified space professionals and having a dedicated unified command to conduct space operations will keep us ahead of our near to peer competitors and will allow the military freedom of movement throughout all domains. In summary, we've discussed GEM and its employment at the operational and strategic levels. We've discussed multi-domain operations, joint intelligence and targeting, and lastly, the evolution of GEM in the space domain. I hope you found today's topics of interest, and I thank you for your time and attention. And now I'll pause for any questions.
So as we have a chat session set up, if you have a question, you can post your question to the chat session. The first one, though, I'll ask Colonel Washington is, you know, sir, you've talked about intelligence staff support predominantly. You've talked about your synergy with multinational partners and interagency as you're forward deployed and also within combatant command headquarters in these task force headquarters. Can you speak to some of the unique data sources and some of the multi-int discipline intelligence that you were able to leverage and how you did that?
Yeah, so I would, looking at Task Force Quiet Storm, one of our key partners was commerce. And for those that don't know, any US commodity over $2,000 that's shipped outside the United States is tracked. And they have what's called ATS, automated tracking system. So it tracks any US commodity over $2,000 that's shipped to a foreign country. So a lot of times you definitely want to make sure that no dual use technology is going to, bad actors. And in the case of the whole US components, what we were finding was that some of these lethal aid networks were procuring US commodities and electrical components and shipping them into Iraq to build these IEDs. So what we were able to do was we were able to take law enforcement sensitive data that commerce had from like bills of lading, from various shipments, and we were able to ingest that into Palantir, which allows you to display in structured networks. And so just that commerce data pool, which was law enforcement sensitive, provided another layer on serialized reporting at the secret and top secret. And it also, kind of acted like a spotlight where we didn't have discoveries, but with that new data, we were able to make discoveries because the network was now, we're now able to see the network as before we weren't with that particular data set.
I appreciate that. And how would you explain how geospatial intelligence fit into your targeting efforts?
Oh, so yes. So thinking of all things flying in space that takes pictures. So from change detection to looking at the various priorities for the commands and having that fidelity of various compounds. For those that don't know, the whole taking down of Osama bin Laden, NGA had a heavy hand in that, as far as their ability to look at the compound and map out the compound and be able to then create like a 3D model for the folks that actually went in and prosecuted the target. So geospatial intelligence goes hand in hand with targeting, but also geospatial intelligence when it comes to forest fires. We're able to, find the hot spots and then therefore, share that information with the forestry so that they're able to obviously focus their efforts to put out the fires in a more effective way. So yeah, geospatial intelligence applicability goes across the board. And what we also find is that a lot of times it's just not geospatial intelligence. I mean, there's other factors that when we take a picture, we have the human aspect where we lay, human intelligence and signals derived intelligence, and then that becomes finished intel. Which also aids into the targeting process as well.
Appreciate that, Colonel Washington. Over to a question in the chat. Iris Almazan and Harry Cooper, if you can.
We have a question from the chat. This is from Danielle. In your experience, which players were the easiest and hardest to work with, and why?
Wow. I would definitely say, working in the UN, that was hard, just because, I mean, for one, you have the language barrier. And a lot of times within the US military, I guess our ability to groom non-commissioned officers and officers, we give our captains or our company grade officers and field grades that left and right limit. And they're able to make informed decisions with, little information, if no information at all. And what I found was in some of the other services or the countries that command and control, or that ability to make decisions at the lowest level, just something simple as far as, a vehicle report had to be made by, a high-ranking officer. So that was frustrating, but just, some of the nations that we had, their technology wasn't, on the same level as ours, and they had different constraints when it came to information sharing as well. So, I may be able to share this, and then I go in thinking that my partner is going to be able to share the same in kind. That wasn't always the case. So with that, that came that rapport building. And so once you were able to garner their trust, you found that, information sharing kind of opened up in some of those multinational settings.
Okay, so that wraps up the chat questions. What we would like to do is we have some time. So We went over so many topics in this briefing, and
Yeah.
I would like to, let's spend some time unraveling your relationship. See the slide here, Task Force Quiet Storm, the relationship with the Director of National Intelligence and some of the players here. What hints were involved? How did you coordinate with the regional desk managers, with NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Terrorism Center that's part of the DNI? Can you unravel some of that?
Okay, so let me see. I'll start with the Task Force Quiet Storm one. The Task Force Quiet Storm, like I laid out, that one was very interesting because a lot of times you think, because we worked with law enforcement, and you think, oh, posse comitatus, intel support to law enforcement, bad, can't do that. But the Patriot Act actually kind of acts as a window and allows, intelligence organizations to support law enforcement. And with that being said, some of our partners from FBI to our international partners within the UK, Scotland Yard. So it was very interesting to see, how information was shared within the various agencies and also countries. And moving to the combined Libya fusion cell, that one within itself. So like Director Clapper, came out for a visit after we had stood it up, and our reports were going back to the National Security Council. And so, they were being picked over, and people were like, oh, well, this isn't anything new. But you also have to understand that the level of intelligence or information that was being shared, was at the lowest levels. And what it did was, like I said, it built, a coalition, and it also improved information sharing. So we may not have been sharing information, say in that cell at a higher classification level, but it opened up other doors where other partners and US agencies were able to share information with some of the members in the cell based on what we had done. And like I said, in the event that there was, a potential over the horizon operation in Libya to fix the destabilization, I would think that the connective tissue that we built with the 6 partner nations would kind of help with that building of the coalition.
I appreciate that. All right, so let's go to your last slide. We were talking about multi-domain operations. Multi-domain operations, the new coined term, really just speaks to working and leveraging forces, joint force capabilities within domains, right? Within those air, land, sea, maritime. You mentioned cognitive, and you mentioned weaponizing information. Can you speak a little bit more to that and what you've seen, one from a threat perspective and also from a posture perspective to either defend or protect?
Right. So yeah, like when we deployed into Iraq, and you had all, and the Marines do this well. They have those cultural cards where they spend an enormous amount of time baselining the culture of various countries so that you have that cultural understanding. And, you had the whole, feet on the back, that was bad. And just that lack of cultural awareness can definitely hamper you when it comes to operations. So that human aspect, the winning the hearts and the minds, is very important. And I mean, for those that have deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq, understand that, sitting down and breaking bread or eating lamb or having a shawarma with some of your host nation counterparts goes a long way. And that's that human aspect. And if you mess up that human aspect, it's hard to get it back, to garner that trust. And so, winning the hearts and minds, that cognitive and the willingness isn't important. And like I said, you know, the social media aspect, how it never seemed to fail. It seemed like we were behind on, you know, terrorist propaganda videos, how their ability to quickly spin something and get it out to the host nation. And it seemed like we were always playing catch up, because there would be a new propaganda video that was talking about how US forces or multinational forces were doing more harm than good. And so that just shows how their ability to use that in their favor, and how, you know, we as Americans or allied forces had to play catch up to win back that trust and willingness of the host nations.
No, that's really important. So people are the key terrain.
Yes, yes.
You know, so shifting gears over to your time at leveraging these different organizations. I mean, amazing capabilities, but again, a lot of challenges with communication and systems and tools. You mentioned Palantir.
Yes.
And you know, that's a networking tool to help you isolate and identify networks, correct?
Correct.
And so, you know, you had the different ints available to you, at least people working for you, or at least reporting to you on different, I guess, insights as they were developed, and you would report that back to the National Security Council and your command there. How did the integration work? Fusion?
Well, so actually for Quiet Storm, the information was going back to basically like their frontline supervisors within their organizations. As we garnered more skin in the game, and we started to disrupt and have more positive effects of disrupting these lethal aid networks, that information was getting reported. Actually, at that time, General Barrier was the CENTCOM J2. So, you know, we went down to CENTCOM and briefed General Barrier on a lot of the successes that we had. The JSOC commander basically came to our spaces and thanked us for some of the actions that we were able to take. I call it free chicken. So we didn't care who prosecuted a target. You know, we would baseline these networks, and we were like, here you go, guys, take action. We see bad that's happening over here. And like I said, it got to a point where we're like, okay, well, is that really the kinetic action? Is that something that we want to take, or do we want to actually watch this individual a little longer, and maybe from his pattern of life, we will have better understanding of the network. He may connect us to other unknown nodes of the network. And so that's where those authorities and capabilities of the other organizations became those weapon systems. So we were able to look at and say, okay, what effect do we actually want to take on the said network? And will it have second and third order effects?
So you were talking about effects. You alluded to a non-lethal effect or a lethal effect. You said kinetic versus some other effect. So
yes.
Yeah, what are some of those other effects that you could actually achieve? What were you trying to get at?
So take in consideration, so the Haqqani network. The Haqqani network,
Afghanistan, right?
Yeah, in Afghanistan, had basically was given almost $1 billion in reconstruction funds. And we were able to display in a structured network how this money from reconstruction funds was winding up in the Haqqani network. And so the Inspector General for, I'm going to mess up the acronym, but it was called SIGAR. And SIGAR was able to actually—
Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction.
Yes, yep. There was
I know that intimately.
was able to actually take back the funds from the various shell companies that Haqqani was using. So we were able to show, like, hey, this money's going to Haqqani network, and obviously it's probably going to support some sort of action against allied forces. And by showing them that, they were able to basically take back the money. And then I also mentioned Treasury OFAC was able to leverage sanctions on various banks that may have been doing business with nefarious actors was another non-lethal action that we were able to take without, putting a red dot or, taking someone off the battlefield.
And so when you decide these actions, these are actually presented to a working group and board, right? To consider,
Yes.
Hey, should we do this?
Yeah. So just, your centers, boards, working groups. So we would have kind of a working group or targeting board at like the worker B level. And then that would move to like the 06 level. And then we would have the director heads for each organization that would then decide on, okay, we want to prosecute this target, but I don't want to have that effect. Let's have this effect. And so it was just like a normal targeting board process, that you would take from, from the worker B level all the way up to say like the J2 or J3, the 1-star or 2-star level.
So these are, so what Colonel Washington, for everyone listening, is really laying out is some sort of joint targeting cycle where there's guidance and strategic direction given for a mission to achieve a certain objective. And all these objectives are nested with strategic guidance, and that's why you got to go back to the government counterparts and liaisons you're working with. And that's why JIMS is so valuable, so important, such a capability enabler for the United States to work together. And you see how many challenges there are with JIM. It's personalities, relationships from the law enforcement community to the military community, understanding your authorities, limitations, constraints, as well as legal left and right limits. And so just executing a target like that Colonel Washington laid out, you would have to just understand who your point of contact is in certain agencies across the intelligence community, and also within your operational agency arms that are their counterparts. So, he just laid out a lot of things. And again, you can read up on this, you can Google this, but how you leverage law enforcement databases and even industry databases. I don't know if we can talk to some of those here. I'll leave it up to you, Colonel Washington, but to lay out this unclassified data laid over classified data to get a better understanding of your operational environment so you can target. And Colonel Washington, you said the task force cell you were in, but you're basically producing fused intelligence for anybody that can execute a target.
Yes. Yeah, because so it was where we sat was in Defense Clandestine Services. So for them, it's all about recruitment. And so what we were doing we weren't recruiting, but we were having an effect on networks. And so what we found was we had to find other partners that liked what we were doing. And so we didn't care who it was, whether that was a 3-letter agency that was willing to take advantage of, our free chicken. I will tell you also, having a lawyer, we had a lawyer, because like when you start talking about these various authorities and what you can do and what you cannot do, I'm not a lawyer. So a lot of times we would take our package and we'd have legal review to make sure that, okay, I'm not going to be testifying in front of Congress about something that I did.
So, you talk about legal review, and we talked about the boards and bureaus and working groups. Now, let's go back to a process. When you're speaking, me as an active duty targeteer, is there a process specifically that you're thinking of, like, decide, detect, deliver, or find, fix, finish, execute, assess, those things? Are you actually thinking through these processes as you're collecting this intelligence?
Yeah, and I think it's like inherent to what we do, because we're process driven. And so just from, if you've been, an intelligence officer or a collection manager for a day, you work through that, receive the information, the dissemination process, the feedback, OODA loop. So, I mean, it's inherent to what we do. And then if it's on the analytical side, you have, your various analytical methods that you go through to make finished intelligence, whether you're using the cone of plausibility or, some sort of analytical method that you're able to deduce medium confidence, high confidence, or low confidence.
That's valuable. So you mentioned cone of plausibility. It's funny you mentioned that because that's one of our structured analytical techniques that we really emphasize in one of our classes. So
the Brits use it well. The Brits use it well, and I learned that when I was in the combined Libya fusion cell. I had a young captain who basically gave us like a 2-hour block on how they use the cone of plausibility. So yeah.
So you're basically, what that is you're identifying drivers and making assumptions about how those drivers will interact with the operational environment to create certain courses of action or options, right?
Yes.
That's pretty interesting. Well, in your experience and thinking much broader, do you see structured analytical techniques used, and which ones have you seen used? We've got a few more minutes, so we're gonna get as much out of you as we can.
All right. You would put me on the spot. So I will say like, so when I was at DIA, the defense intelligence reports that we use kind of like a hybrid of alternative futures and cone of plausibility. So I had a professor, Dr. Hanlon, who talked about alternative futures. So basically looking at a particular group and based off of patterns and trends, what would be an alternate future that this particular group would take. And so a lot of the assessments that you look at, or intel assessments or finished intelligence, kind of use a hybrid of alternative futures, cone of plausibility, and whatnot.
Yeah, because they really force you to think pieces you're missing, come up with wild card scenarios, and bring in brainstorming folks from across the gamut to help you red hat yourself. Basically.
Yeah. I will say, so like some of the best analysts that I had when I was just throughout my career were lawyers, because going through law school and being able to read through a lot of information and come up with key findings based off of that information, and the logic, being able to understand and not coming up with leaps of logic just because this happened over here and this happened over there. You automatically assume that this is the potential outcome, but you're missing everything in between. Yes, they were pretty rock star analysts, when it came to their capabilities.
Appreciate that, Colonel Washington. So I'll turn it out to the group. Are there any last minute questions as we wrap this up? We'll give it a couple of minutes. You can post them in the chat. While we're waiting on that, Colonel Washington, I got to say, this has been really an eye-opener, I think, for a lot of folks attending today. And we'll definitely be able to use this for our students. And I hope the students can see that you started, you took your path and you're active duty now. You rose to the ranks, but some of these tools that you get garnered from an analytical perspective and leadership, both of those things are so important. You have the practitioner side, and you also have leadership. And that would be my last question if nobody has additional questions. How did you balance the two, being a skilled practitioner of your art and also the leadership that is extremely instrumental in basically establishing that foundation and making you who you are as a successful analyst and a successful intelligence officer?
I think it started on at like an early age, like when my very first assignment in the 524 MI battalion, I was the battalion motor officer. And I didn't know anything about motor stables or, I thought it was an alternator